when you're calling to schedule your reservation for a seminar. All these little stresses cause these little twinges of the fight or flight response. And the accumulation of these inappropriately activated stress responses probably have a lot to do with the wear and tear on our physiology, which are responsible for many of the common illnesses that we're facing today. So high blood pressure, heart disease, insomnia, anxiety, depression. These are all reflections of exhaustion of the system due to this continuous, frequent activation of the stress response. The second stage of this understanding of mind-body interactions really was developed by a great Canadian endocrinologist named Hans Selye. Hans Selye brought in the understanding that not only does the nervous system contribute to activation when we're facing a challenging event in our lives, but also our endocrine system, that our hormones are intimately involved in the process of how we regulate homeostasis, balance in our lives. When I was a freshman medical student at the University of Chicago, I was already considered a little bit marginal because I was teaching meditation to my classmates. And to try to gain some level of credibility, I actually arranged for Dr. Selye to come to do grand rounds at Billings Hospital, because he was really one of the major researchers on the role of stress on physiology. And so I had this entire auditorium packed with about 400 faculty and students at the University of Chicago, including probably about 6 Nobel Prize winners in the audience. And it was scheduled to start at noon, and Dr. Selye was nowhere to be found. So I was beginning to have my own stress response. I ran to the nearest phone, called his office in Montreal, and said, "Where's Dr. Selye?" And his assistant informed me that as far as she knew, he had arrived in Chicago the evening before. So I was walking back to this auditorium with visions of Dr. Selye having been kidnapped or trying to change a tire on the side of the road, and was making in my mind my apologies to the entire university staff, certain now that I would never be accepted again. When I walked into the room, and there was Dr. Selye up there speaking, he had come in another door as I was walking out the auditorium. No one was even there to introduce him, so he just started talking. And as I sat down, he was describing the physiological changes that occur with the stress response. I thought, there's a great experiential understanding. And then the final component, or the most recent component of this understanding, has really been this recognition that there is a direct linkage between the nervous system and our immune system. So we can affect our immune system through our nervous system, particularly our sympathetic or stress nervous system. We can affect our nervous system through our endocrine system, through our hormones. And there are actually really fascinating pictures now of the nervous system directly encasing immune cells in our spleen, in our thymus, in the bone marrow, so that almost instantly when we have a stress response, the immune cells are revved up, almost as if it's a car at the Indianapolis 500 where you have those gasoline lines hooked up to the car, ready to go as soon as the information has been transmitted. And the information is continuously feeding back into the nervous system as well. We have a stress in the mind. The brain communicates that stress to a deep center called the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is really the conductor of our responses. It has influences directly on the pituitary gland, which controls the hormonal system, and it has direct input into the sympathetic nervous system, which controls our stress responses. So we interpret an experience, we communicate that experience to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus then communicates that to the pituitary gland, to the nervous system. The pituitary gland then may cause the adrenal gland to release cortisol. The nervous system may cause the inner part of the adrenal gland to release adrenaline. Both of these chemicals have a direct effect on our immune cells. And then the immune cells feed back the information. It's amazing how quickly this communication network occurs. It's been shown now that if you give your child an immunization to, say, chickenpox, within about 6 minutes, you can see changes in the brain of that child even before you can see any type of changes in the blood. As soon as there's a change in the environment, information is transmitted quickly to the brain, which brings its attention to begin to organize the appropriate response. One of the chemicals that acts is called interleukin-1. There's actually now about 15 of these interleukins. Inter means between, leukin means blood cells, or white blood cells. So these interleukins are these chemicals that these white blood cells or these lymphocytes make to communicate both to each other and back to the brain. And so to complete the network, not only does the brain communicate by way of the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland, to the sympathetic nervous system, to our immune cell, but the immune cell is feeding back information continuously to the nervous system. It's an ongoing conversation. So that's the basic science. Let's talk a little bit about how it applies to real life. Although it took a while for people to pay attention, one of the earliest and most fascinating studies was done by Dr. Robert Ader at Ohio State University. He was trying to do a Pavlovian study. So remember, Pavlov, a Russian scientist, showed that if you ring a bell every time you feed your dog, which causes them, of course, to salivate, pretty soon, just by ringing the bell, the dog will begin to salivate, even without introducing the food. Because they've associated the sound of the bell with an experience. It's called the neuroassociative conditioned response. Neuroassociative conditioned response. And we'll be using that a lot throughout this course to teach you how to create the best possible associations. What Robert Ader wanted to do is to see if he could create a similar response between a taste and an experience. So what he did was take some rats. He put an intravenous line into a vein in their tail. He then brought into their cages some water that was sweetened with saccharin. And as soon as the rat tasted the saccharin with its tongue, he injected a very strong chemical called cyclophosphamide, or cytoxin. It's a medicine that we use today as a chemotherapy drug used in a number of other immune disorders. And it has, as a very prompt side effect, severe nausea and vomiting. So as soon as the rat's tongue hit the sweet water, he injected this dose of this medication, which instantly caused the rat to become overwhelmingly nauseated and to vomit. Delightful, huh? Okay. Then he followed these rats, and over the course of the next 10 days, the bone marrows and the lymph glands showed a suppression in activity, because this is a very powerful immune-suppressing drug. He waited until they recovered completely, taking several weeks. And then he repeated the experiment. This time, he put the same intravenous line into their vein. He exposed them to the same saccharin-sweetened water. But instead of injecting this powerful drug, he just injected some sugar water. As soon as the rat's tongue touched the saccharin, they became nauseated and vomited. Because it was such a strong memory from the previous experience that without any further intervention, they got sick. The same way that ringing the bell caused the dog to salivate. That was expected. But what was unexpected is that if you followed their immune system for the next 7 to 10 days, they showed the same level of suppression as if they had gotten this potent drug. Just the interpretation of this experience had a profound and measurable change on their physical state. Do you see how amazing this study was? It's really the first time that someone had scientifically shown that just an interpretation in the mind could have a profound effect that could affect the well-being of an animal. And from that, there were a whole host of fascinating studies looking at how this might apply to human beings. Many scientists searched for models of behavior that were under stress. And a great model for that is being a medical student. Another great thing about medical students is that they're very willing subjects because they have this thing about authority. And so medical students have been a great model for stress, and several studies have looked at what happens to medical students under times of stress. If a medical student was not well prepared for a final anatomy examination, you could measure their immune function and show that